What happens when a courtroom goes silent and a man realizes his life is over? Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. Imagine sitting there, hands folded, eyes fixed forward, knowing that the next sentence spoken will divide your life into two parts, before and after. No rewind, no appeal that erases what's coming. Just a final decision that lands heavier than anything you've ever felt. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's where this story begins. Not with flashing police lights, not with headlines, not even with bloodshed. It begins with silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. The kind that makes people shift uncomfortably in their seats. The kind where even breathing feels too loud. A courtroom packed with strangers, reporters, observers, and a family shattered beyond repair. Everyone waiting for the same thing. Everyone pretending they aren't afraid to hear it. And at the center of that room sits Nick Reiner. A son, a defendant, a man about to hear words that cannot be taken back. But here's the part most people don't understand yet. The moment Nick breaks down in that courtroom isn't about guilt or innocence. It isn't even about the sentence itself. It's about something deeper. Something that traces back weeks earlier, to a night that refuses to stay buried, no matter how many times people try to move on. Because this case isn't just about what happened. It's about what people think happened. It's about what was said too quickly, and what was never said at all. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever noticed how fast the public makes up its mind? One headline, one leaked detail, one quote taken out of context. And suddenly the story is finished before it's even told. But this story? This one refuses to behave. It twists. It contradicts itself. It leaves uncomfortable gaps. And those gaps are exactly where the truth hides. On a quiet Sunday in December, two people were found dead inside a multi-million-dollar Brentwood estate. The kind of home people slow down to look at. The kind of place associated with success, safety, legacy. A house that should have felt untouchable. Instead, it became the center of a nightmare. Rob Reiner, 78 years old. Michelle Reiner, 70. Married. Established. Surrounded by privilege most people will never experience. Gone. The official language was clinical. Detached. Cold. Cause of death. Manner of death. Date of death. Words that reduce human lives to paperwork. And almost immediately, the focus shifted. Not outward. Not to strangers. But inward. Toward the family. Toward the son who lived on the same property. Toward the guest house just steps away from the main residence. Toward a man who, until that moment, was largely invisible to the public eye. Nick Reiner was 32 years old. And from the moment police arrived, his name never stopped circulating. Here's where things get complicated. Because this wasn't a case built solely on evidence. It was built on relationships, on history, on tension that existed long before sirens ever echoed through that neighborhood. And one person, in particular, would play a role that still divides opinion to this day. Romy Reiner, 27 years old. Daughter. Sister. According to reports, it was Romy who alerted authorities to a dangerous family member. Someone she believed should be a suspect. That phrase alone would ripple through the investigation like a shockwave. Dangerous. Think about that word. Not angry. Not unstable. Dangerous. What does it take to describe someone you grew up with that way? Was it fear? Was it intuition? Was it knowledge the public still doesn't have? Or was it something else entirely? Because once that word entered the conversation, the trajectory of the case changed forever. From that point on, every action Nick took was viewed through a single lens. Every silence became suspicious. Every inconsistency felt intentional. Every emotional reaction was interpreted as performance rather than pain. And this is where the story starts to fracture. Because human beings don't experience trauma cleanly. They don't react in neat, logical ways. They contradict themselves. They forget details. They say the wrong thing at the worst possible moment. But the justice system doesn't like contradictions. It likes narratives. Simple ones. A quiet night. A violent act. A clear suspect. And yet, nothing about this case was simple. The date itself raised questions. Sunday, December 14th. A day that, depending on who you ask, unfolded very differently. Timelines overlapped. Accounts blurred. Small details suddenly mattered more than anyone expected. Who saw whom last? Who heard what? Who didn't hear anything at all? And perhaps most unsettling of all, who spoke first. Because in cases like this, the first story often becomes the story, even if it's incomplete, even if it's wrong. As investigators worked, the media moved faster. Headlines appeared before facts settled. Social media filled the gaps with speculation, anger, and certainty. Everyone seemed sure they understood what happened, except the people inside the family. Except the man sitting alone in that courtroom months later, staring straight ahead, barely blinking, as his entire existence narrowed to a single question. What will they decide? This is why the breakdown matters. Not because it was dramatic, not because cameras caught it, but because it was the first crack in a carefully maintained exterior. Up until that moment, Nick had been described in extremes. Either cold and calculating or eerily calm. Either manipulative or disturbingly detached. But when the verdict approached, something shifted. Witnesses would later describe his hands shaking, his breathing changing, his focus slipping. Not the behavior of someone putting on a show, but of someone losing control of a reality they can no longer influence. And then the words came. Guilty. 2 counts. The room reacted before Nick did. Gasps. Movement. A ripple of energy that felt almost electric. Some people looked at him. Others looked away. And Nick? He didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He didn't lash out. Not yet. Because the verdict wasn't the end. Sentencing was still coming. And sentencing is where hope goes to die. This is the part most people don't prepare for. They think the verdict is the climax. It isn't. It's just the doorway. Beyond it waits something far worse. Finality. Days passed. Tension built. The courtroom filled again. And this time, there was no ambiguity about why everyone was there. When the judge entered, the atmosphere changed. This wasn't about arguments anymore. This wasn't about interpretation. This was about consequence. Nick stood, then sat, then stood again. And when the sentence was announced, when the words death penalty entered the air, something inside him finally broke. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. Observers would later say it looked like realization, not shock. As if, in that moment, he finally understood something he'd been refusing to accept since that December night. That this was real, that it was happening, that there was no version of the future where he walked away. His breakdown wasn't a single moment. It was a process, a slow unraveling that left the room unsettled rather than satisfied. And then, barely audible, Nick whispered something. Just a few words. Words that didn't make sense to most people at first. Words that weren't part of any statement. Words that weren't directed at the judge, or the jury, or the cameras. Words that would haunt everyone who heard them. But to understand why he said them, and what they might mean, we have to go back. Back before the verdict. Back before the accusations. Back to the night everything broke. Because what came next would change everything. What really happens on the night everything changes. Not the version you see in headlines. Not the version condensed into police reports. But the version that exists in fragments. In silences. In moments that don't seem important until it's too late. Because the truth is, the most devastating nights rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly. Sunday evenings are supposed to feel slow. Predictable. The world easing into Monday with one last breath of calm. And in Brentwood, on that December night, nothing about the neighborhood looked unusual. No shouting. No alarms. No chaos spilling into the street. Just expensive homes tucked behind gates. Soft lighting. A sense of distance from everything dangerous. That's the first contradiction people struggle with. How could something so violent begin in a place that looked so safe? Let's rewind. The Reiner estate wasn't a single structure. It was a property. A compound, really. The main house stood as the center, large, imposing, polished. And just far enough away to feel separate sat the guest house. That separation matters. Because physical distance creates emotional distance. And emotional distance creates blind spots. Nick Reiner lived in the guest house. Close enough to be present. Far enough to be alone. Ask yourself this. How well do you really know what happens behind walls that aren't yours? That night, there were no reports of an argument spilling into the driveway. No neighbors calling about noise. No obvious signs that a family was on the brink of destruction. And that's exactly why investigators would later describe the night as deceptively calm. The hours before everything unraveled were ordinary by most accounts. Phones were used. Lights were on. Doors were closed. Nothing about the timeline screamed danger, which raises an uncomfortable question. If nothing seemed wrong, when did it go wrong? Because at some point, two people inside that main house stopped being safe, and no one noticed until it was already over. When authorities would later describe the scene, they used careful language. They always do. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. Words designed to explain without forcing anyone to imagine too much. But even stripped of detail, the conclusion was unavoidable. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random. It was intentional. And immediately, attention turned inward. Not to a stranger, not to a break-in, but to the people who belonged there. Nick was on the property that night. That single fact would become a weight he could never put down. Here's where perception starts doing damage. From the outside, people assumed proximity meant involvement. That being nearby meant being aware. That sharing land meant sharing responsibility. But life doesn't work that neatly. Think about it. How many times have you been physically close to someone and emotionally miles away? The guest house wasn't connected to the main residence. It had its own entrance, its own routines, its own silence. And silence is dangerous because it allows assumptions to grow unchecked. At some point, something triggered concern. It wasn't Nick who called police. It wasn't a neighbor. It was Romy. And when she spoke, she didn't describe a break-in. She didn't mention confusion. She didn't express uncertainty. She pointed inward. Reports would later say she told police there was a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. That phrasing is critical. She didn't say, "I think." She didn't say, "maybe." She framed it as a warning. Imagine being an investigator hearing that. Imagine standing in a home where two people are dead and being told the threat might be someone you expect to trust. From that moment on, the investigation gained momentum, but also bias. Because once an idea takes root, everything else bends around it. Nick's actions that night became evidence even before they were understood. Where was he? What was he doing? Why didn't he notice sooner? Questions that sound reasonable, until you realize how often people don't notice things at all. How often we assume silence means peace. Nick was questioned, and from the start, observers noted something that would later be used against him. His demeanor. He wasn't hysterical. He wasn't loud. He didn't perform grief the way people expected. Instead, he was described as subdued, controlled, almost detached. And here comes another contradiction. People say they want honesty. But what they really want is familiarity. They want reactions that match their expectations. When someone doesn't cry at the right moment or speak at the right time, suspicion creeps in. Ask yourself honestly, how would you react if your world collapsed in one night? Would you scream? Would you shut down? Would you say nothing at all? There's no correct answer, but the public always thinks there is. As the night turned into early morning, the estate became a crime scene. Tape. Flashing lights. Movement where there had once been stillness. And somewhere on that property, Nick sat with a reality he didn't yet understand. His parents were gone, and somehow, without being charged yet, he was already becoming the story. The timeline would later be dissected to exhaustion. Minutes mattered. Phone records mattered. Movements mattered. But what mattered most was perception. Nick lived there. Nick was an adult. Nick didn't call first. Those three facts alone would haunt every phase of the case. Investigators would say they saw no signs of forced entry. That detail would echo everywhere. Online, in news segments, in comment sections filled with certainty. No forced entry means someone was let in, or someone was already there. And just like that, the narrative narrowed. But here's something most people overlook. No forced entry doesn't mean no possibility. It doesn't mean no alternative explanation. It just means one door wasn't broken. Yet that single detail would be treated like a confession. As dawn broke, the story began traveling faster than the facts. By the time the public learned the names involved, opinions were already forming. A son, a famous father, a brutal outcome. The internet doesn't wait. And Nick didn't know it yet, but the version of him being constructed online would soon overshadow anything he said or did in real life. By the end of that day, his name wasn't just connected to tragedy. It was connected to suspicion. Charges would follow. Arrests would be made. Language would harden. Allegedly, would slowly disappear from conversations. But on that first night, before lawyers, before courtrooms, before verdicts, there was only confusion, and one voice that had already framed the danger. Romy's. Why did she say what she said? Was it fear based on something specific? Was it intuition? Was it history the public doesn't know? Or was it a moment of panic that took on a life of its own? Because once the idea of a dangerous family member entered the room, nothing that followed was neutral anymore. Every pause became suspicious. Every explanation felt defensive. Every emotion was judged. And Nick was trapped inside a story that was accelerating beyond his control. This is the part people forget when they argue about guilt or innocence. The night itself doesn't decide everything. The interpretation does. And what came next, the interviews, the statements, the early investigative choices, would lock this case onto a path that few ever escape. But the most important moment of that night? It wasn't when police arrived. It wasn't when the bodies were found. It was when suspicion found a name. Because once that happened, the outcome may have already been set in motion. What makes a sister warn police about her own family? That's not a rhetorical question. Sit with it for a second. What would it take for you to look an officer in the eye, on the worst night of your life, and say the words, dangerous family member? Not someone might know something. Not, there's been tension. But dangerous. That word doesn't slip out accidentally. And once Rob Reiner said it, nothing that followed would ever be neutral again. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people ignore. Investigations don't just follow evidence. They follow direction. And direction often comes from the very first voice that speaks with certainty. On that December night, Romi's voice mattered more than she may have realized. Or perhaps more than she ever admitted. Let's slow this moment down. Police arrive at the Brentwood estate. The scene is controlled, professional, quiet in the way only tragedy can be quiet. Officers are trained to observe everything. Not just what's in front of them, but who speaks first, who hesitates, who fills silence. Romi doesn't hesitate. According to reports, she tells them there is a family member they should look at. Someone she believes poses a danger. Someone who should not be overlooked. Notice what she doesn't say. She doesn't accuse directly. She doesn't describe an act. She doesn't offer proof. She offers framing. And framing is powerful. Once you suggest danger, every behavior afterward is filtered through that lens. Calm becomes cold. Silence becomes deception. Confusion becomes calculation. Ask yourself this. If police had arrived without that warning, would the night have unfolded the same way? We'll never know. But the impact of Romi's words is undeniable. Because from that point forward, Nick Reiner wasn't just a grieving son. He was a potential threat. And that distinction changes everything. Now, before people rush to judgment, let's be clear about something. There are reasons a sibling might speak up. Real reasons. History matters. Context matters. Fear doesn't come from nowhere. But fear can also be shaped by past arguments, by misunderstandings, by moments taken out of proportion. So the real question isn't whether Romi believed what she said. The real question is why. What did she know or think she knew that made her choose those words? Family insiders would later describe long-standing tension within the household. Not explosive conflict, but something quieter, more corrosive. Expectations, disappointments, emotional distance. And if you've ever grown up under the shadow of a powerful parent, you understand how pressure doesn't always look like pressure. Sometimes it looks like silence at the dinner table. Sometimes it looks like conversations that never happen. Sometimes it looks like siblings experiencing the same home in completely different ways. Romi and Nick didn't share identical perspectives. No siblings ever do. But in the aftermath of tragedy, perspective becomes evidence. Investigators would later examine Romi's statements carefully. Not just what she said, but how she said it. The timing, the emphasis, the emotional tone. Was she calm? Was she shaken? Was she rehearsed? Every detail was scrutinized. And here's where contradiction enters the story. Some accounts describe Romi as composed, even resolute. Others describe her as overwhelmed, frightened, trying to make sense of chaos. Both versions can be true. Trauma doesn't produce one consistent reaction. But to the public, nuance doesn't survive. Online discussions quickly painted her in extremes. To some, she was brave. The sister who spoke up when it mattered. The one who put truth above blood. To others, she became something else entirely. A catalyst. A spark. The person whose words may have sealed her brother's fate before he ever had a chance to explain himself. And that divide never healed. Because Romi's warning didn't stay confined to police reports. It leaked. Whether intentionally or not, it found its way into headlines. And once it did, it became a cornerstone of the narrative. Sister warned police. Sister feared dangerous family member. Those phrases carry weight. They suggest insider knowledge. They imply history the public can't see. And most importantly, they encourage certainty. People trust siblings. If your own sister says you're dangerous, who's going to question it? But that trust comes with a cost. Because once Romy's words became public, Nick lost something he would never get back. The presumption of neutrality. From that moment on, everything he said was reactive, defensive, explained instead of heard. Let's talk about how investigators treat such warnings. Police are trained to prioritize safety. When someone suggests danger, they don't dismiss it. They lean into it. And that makes sense. Lives may be at risk. But leaning into a theory early can also narrow an investigation prematurely. That's not an accusation. It's a reality. Once Nick became the focus, other possibilities faded into the background. Not erased, but deprioritized. And in complex cases, deprioritization can be decisive. Nick was questioned again and again. Each time, the same underlying assumption hovered in the air. If you weren't involved, why did your sister fear you? That's not a fair question, but it's a powerful one. Because how do you defend yourself against someone else's fear? You can't disprove an emotion. And Nick didn't help himself. Not because he was guilty, but because he didn't perform the role people wanted him to play. He didn't lash out. He didn't beg. He didn't collapse. Instead, he retreated inward. That behavior, combined with Romy's warning, created a narrative that felt complete even when it wasn't. Let's pause here and ask something uncomfortable. Have you ever been misunderstood by someone close to you? Now imagine that misunderstanding happening on the worst day of your life, with police listening, and the consequences lasting forever. Because that's the position Nick found himself in. As days passed, Romy's role became more complicated. She wasn't just a witness. She wasn't just a family member. She was a symbol. Her warning was cited repeatedly, in conversations, in analysis, in arguments about motive. And yet, there were gaps. Romy didn't publicly explain her reasoning in detail. She didn't give long interviews clarifying her fear. She didn't walk back her words, but she didn't expand on them either. Silence again. And silence invites speculation. Some began asking questions they hadn't considered before. What history existed between the siblings? Were there arguments no one knew about? Did Romy fear something specific or something imagined? Those questions never received clear answers. And in the absence of answers, people filled the void. Supporters of the prosecution treated Romy's warning as proof. Supporters of the defense treated it as bias, as panic, as an emotional reaction mistaken for fact. And Romy herself? She remained largely out of sight, which only made her presence loom larger. By the time the case moved forward, Romy's words were baked into its foundation, not as evidence in the technical sense, but as context, as tone, as justification for where the investigation had gone. And here's where the story takes another turn. Because while the public focused on what Romy said, fewer people paid attention to what she didn't say. She didn't describe violence. She didn't recount a threat. She didn't reference a confession. She offered a warning, not a narrative. And warnings are interpreted by the listener. Police interpreted it one way. Media interpreted it another. The public interpreted it 100 different ways. But Nick? He experienced it as something else entirely. A fracture. From that moment on, the divide between brother and sister became permanent. Even before the trial. Even before charges were finalized. Because once your own sibling frames you as dangerous, there is no return to normalcy. That word follows you. It echoes. And when the case finally reached the courtroom, Romy's warning would resurface again, not as testimony, but as atmosphere. As something jurors felt even if they never heard it directly. That's the hidden power of early narratives. They shape outcomes long before verdicts are read. And as the legal process moved forward, Nick would find himself fighting not just evidence, but an image of himself that had already been constructed. An image born on a single night, from a single sentence, spoken by the person who knew him since childhood. But in the next chapter, we need to step back even further. Because before accusations, before warnings, before December 14th, there was a version of Nick Reiner the public never knew. And understanding who he was before the headlines may be the key to understanding everything that followed. Because every monster narrative begins by erasing the before. And that erasure might be the most dangerous thing of all. Who was Nick Reiner before the world decided who he was? Not the version reduced to mugshots and court sketches. Not the caricature shaped by speculation and fear. But the human being who existed quietly, imperfectly, before December turned everything into accusation. Because every story like this has a hidden chapter. The one nobody bothers to read once the ending feels decided. Before his name became synonymous with suspicion, Nick lived a life that didn't draw attention. And that, ironically, would later be used against him. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't outspoken. He wasn't eager to be seen. In a family surrounded by visibility, Nick preferred the edges. Ask yourself something. What happens to a person who grows up inside a powerful legacy but doesn't quite fit it? Some rebel loudly. Some chase approval relentlessly. And some disappear into themselves. Nick chose the third option. Friends would later describe him as reserved, thoughtful, a listener rather than a talker. Someone who could sit in a room full of people and remain almost invisible, not out of fear, but comfort. But invisibility has consequences. Because when people don't know you well, they fill in the blanks themselves. Nick's childhood was structured, privileged, yes, but also heavy with expectation. Success wasn't encouraged. It was assumed. Achievement wasn't praised. It was expected. That kind of environment does something subtle to a person. It teaches you that love is conditional. That silence means disappointment. That approval is something you earn, not something you receive. And over time, that lesson can hollow someone out. Nick didn't lash out against it. He didn't dramatize his struggle. He internalized it. He moved into the guest house not as a sign of rejection, but separation. A way to breathe. A way to exist without constantly being measured against something larger than himself. People would later ask why he lived there, as if independence itself were suspicious. But for Nick, the guest house was refuge. Distance without disappearance. Presence without pressure. He was close to his parents, but not in the way people imagine closeness. It was quiet, polite, controlled. No screaming matches. No dramatic fights. Just a kind of emotional quiet that never quite resolves. And here's the contradiction no one wanted to confront. A volatile, dangerous person usually leaves a trail. Anger, threats, outbursts. But those who knew Nick struggled to identify any pattern like that. Instead, they described someone who withdrew when overwhelmed. Someone who shut down instead of exploding. And yet, when tragedy struck, that very trait became suspect. Because the public doesn't trust calm. Especially not after violence. Nick's social circle was small, intentional. He didn't overshare. He didn't seek validation online. He wasn't building an image. And in the age of constant performance, that absence felt wrong to people. Why so quiet? Why so private? Suspicion loves emptiness. Nick wasn't unemployed. He wasn't drifting aimlessly. He was figuring things out, slowly, without the urgency the outside world demanded. But patience is often mistaken for avoidance. And when the case broke, every ordinary aspect of his life was reframed. His solitude became isolation. His introspection became detachment. His emotional restraint became lack of remorse. Let's pause and ask a hard question. How many people do you know who process pain quietly? Now imagine those people under a microscope after tragedy. Nick didn't cry on command. He didn't speak in dramatic sound bites. He didn't perform grief the way audiences expect. And because of that, the narrative hardened. Before December, Nick's life didn't fit a headline. After December, it fit one too easily. Investigators would dig into his past looking for warning signs. And when they couldn't find obvious ones, subtle moments were magnified. A tense conversation here. An awkward silence there. A misunderstood text. Suddenly, ordinary human behavior became evidence of something darker. But context matters. Nick had spent years learning to keep things inside. To not burden others. To avoid conflict by withdrawing rather than confronting. That coping mechanism didn't make him dangerous. But it did make him unreadable. And unreadable people frighten those who want certainty. Here's where things turn even more uncomfortable. Because Nick's identity became defined not by what he did, but by what he didn't do. He didn't rush into the main house that night. He didn't discover the bodies himself. He didn't call first. Each absence became an accusation. But absence doesn't equal intent. Sometimes it just means you weren't there. Still, The pressure mounted. Nick's past was dissected publicly. People who had never met him debated his character with absolute confidence. Armchair psychologists diagnosed him from afar. They ignored one inconvenient truth. If Nick were capable of calculated violence, he would have shown signs long before December. Instead, the portrait that emerged was of a man struggling quietly under expectations he never asked for. And yet, something still didn't sit right. Even among those who defended him, there was discomfort. Because while Nick didn't look like the monster people wanted him to be, there were gaps, silences, unanswered questions that refused to disappear. What was he thinking that night? What did he know, and when did he know it? Those questions hovered, and the prosecution would later exploit them masterfully. They didn't need to prove Nick was violent by nature. They only needed to suggest he was capable. And capability is easier to argue than intent. Nick's emotional detachment, real or perceived, became central to the story. Witnesses would later say he appeared off, not distraught enough, not broken enough. But grief doesn't come with a template. Some people scream. Some people freeze. Some people disappear inside themselves. Nick froze, and freezing is often misread as indifference. As the case moved forward, Nick's past was no longer his own. It was reassembled piece by piece into something unrecognizable. His quietness became secrecy. His independence became estrangement. His coping mechanisms became character flaws. And the more that version of Nick circulated, the harder it became to remember the man he had been before, even for the people who loved him. Because once the narrative shifts, memory follows. By the time the trial approached, Nick was no longer just a defendant. He was an idea, a symbol of family betrayal, a cautionary tale about hidden darkness. And symbols don't get the benefit of nuance. But here's the twist. While the public focused on who Nick was before the headlines, the courtroom would soon focus on something else entirely. Not his past, not his personality, but the evidence. Cold, clinical, unforgiving. And that evidence would be presented in a way designed to erase the before completely. Because once jurors stop seeing a human being and start seeing a case, outcomes become inevitable. What if the most powerful voice in the courtroom never belonged to a person at all? No emotion, no hesitation, no memory lapses, just evidence. Cold, precise, unforgiving. That's what the jury was told to trust above everything else. Not instincts, not sympathy, not the noise outside the courtroom. Facts don't lie, they were reminded. Facts don't get scared. Facts don't betray family. But here's the problem. Facts don't speak for themselves. They're spoken for. And in this case, how the evidence was framed mattered just as much as what the evidence actually was. The prosecution knew this from the beginning. They didn't open with emotion. They didn't rely on character assassination. They built a structure, step by step, brick by brick, a narrative designed to feel inevitable. 2 people dead, no forced entry, a son on the property. Simple, clean, almost too clean. From the very first presentation, the jury was guided toward one conclusion without being explicitly told to reach it. That's the art of persuasion. You don't push. You lead. The evidence was introduced slowly, deliberately, like a tightening loop. Timelines came first. Who was where? Who was awake? Who was asleep? Sunday evening became a grid of minutes. Each minute assigned meaning. Each gap treated as opportunity. Nick's presence on the property was emphasized repeatedly, not shouted. Repeated. Over and over. The kind of repetition that sinks in quietly. He was there. He was nearby. He had access. Access is a dangerous word in court, because access implies possibility, and possibility implies capability. The prosecution didn't need to prove Nick planned anything in advance. They didn't even need to prove motive in a way that made emotional sense. They needed to prove opportunity. And opportunity, they argued, was undeniable. The guest house was close. The path was unobstructed. The doors showed no signs of damage. Again and again, jurors heard the same phrase in different forms. No forced entry. Think about how that sounds to someone sitting in a jury box. It sounds final. It sounds conclusive. It sounds like a locked room mystery with only one answer. But no forced entry doesn't mean no entry. It means no broken locks, no shattered glass, no obvious signs of intrusion. That distinction matters. And yet, it was rarely emphasized. Instead, the prosecution let the implication do the work. If no one broke in, then someone who belonged there must have done it. And who belonged there? Nick. This is where the evidence started to feel less like information and more like pressure. Phone records were introduced next. Calls, messages, gaps. The jury was shown when Nick used his phone, when he didn't, when activity stopped and started again. Patterns were suggested. Pauses were highlighted. But here's the contradiction that rarely gets discussed. Phone data tells you what a device did, not what a person thought. Silence on a phone can mean sleep. It can mean distraction. It can mean nothing at all. But in court, silence was framed as something else. As deliberation. As concealment. As calculation. The defense objected. They always do. But objections don't erase impressions. The impression had already formed. Nick wasn't frantically calling anyone. He wasn't texting for help. He wasn't panicking on record. And to jurors, that felt wrong. But ask yourself something. If something unimaginable happens near you, not in front of you, not announced to you, would your phone reflect that immediately? Or would there be a delay? Investigators pointed out moments where Nick could have moved unnoticed. Minutes that didn't have witnesses. Time frames that couldn't be accounted for with certainty. They didn't say this is when it happened. They said this is when it could have happened. And possibility became probability through repetition. The physical evidence followed. Carefully described. Carefully sanitized. No graphic detail. Just conclusions. The manner of death. The certainty of intent. The absence of struggle in certain areas. Again, the framing was subtle. If there was no obvious sign of forced intrusion, if the environment didn't show chaos everywhere, then maybe the victims trusted the person they encountered. Trust implies familiarity. Familiarity points inward. But the defense pushed back. They argued that a lack of forced entry proves nothing on its own. That people don't always lock doors. That safety breeds complacency. That homes like this often feel immune to danger. They argued that timelines built on assumptions are fragile. That minutes don't equal actions. That quiet people don't behave like movie characters. But here's the brutal reality of trials. Rebuttals sound like excuses to people who already lean toward belief. And the prosecution knew exactly when to introduce their most persuasive tool. Expert testimony. Experts speak with authority, with confidence, with credentials that make jurors sit up straighter. Forensic analysts, behavioral specialists, crime scene interpreters. Each one explained a piece of the puzzle. Each one reinforced the same underlying idea. This was personal. This was intentional. This was someone close. Notice something important. No expert testified that they saw Nick commit anything. They testified about likelihoods, patterns, commonalities. In cases like this, common becomes convincing. The defense tried to reframe. They pointed out that experts interpret data through theory. That conclusions are not facts, but opinions grounded in training. That two experts can look at the same information and disagree completely. But juries don't like uncertainty. They crave closure. And the prosecution offered it in the form of coherence. Everything fit together. Too well. And that's where doubt should have entered. Because real life is rarely that tidy. But then something unexpected happened. Buried deep in the evidence was a detail that didn't align. A small inconsistency. One the prosecution mentioned briefly and moved past quickly. The defense noticed it immediately. It had to do with timing. A narrow window where something didn't add up cleanly. Where movement would have had to be precise. Where assumptions stacked on top of each other to hold the story upright. On its own, it didn't overturn the case. But it cracked it. Just enough. The defense attempted to widen that crack. They slowed the pace. Replayed moments. Asked jurors to imagine alternative explanations. What if the timeline was off by minutes? What if someone else had access that wasn't considered significant? What if the absence of evidence was being treated as proof? For the first time, the room felt different. Not convinced, but unsettled. And unsettled juries ask questions. That's dangerous for the prosecution. Because once jurors start imagining alternatives, certainty dissolves. But the prosecution anticipated this. They returned to the strongest element of all. Context. They reminded jurors of Romy's warning. Not directly, not overtly, but through phrasing. Concerns raised early. Family dynamics. Internal risk. They didn't need to say her name. The implication was already there. This wasn't random. This wasn't external. This was inside the family. The defense objected again. Context isn't evidence. Emotion isn't fact, but context shapes belief, and belief decides verdicts. By the time closing arguments approached, the evidence had done its job, not by overwhelming with volume, but by narrowing options. The jury wasn't being asked to choose between dozens of possibilities. They were being asked to choose between one story that fit and everything else that felt hypothetical. Nick sat through it all, expressionless, still, contained, and again, his demeanor became part of the evidence. Even though it shouldn't have been, people watched him as much as they watched the screen. Did he flinch? Did he look away? Did he react? When he didn't, the silence spoke louder than any chart. But the defense knew something the jury didn't yet fully grasp. That cases built on interpretation can collapse when one assumption falls apart. And that assumption, the one about access, timing, and inevitability, was more fragile than it looked, because one overlooked detail refused to disappear. A detail the prosecution hoped would fade, a detail that suggested the night wasn't as contained as they claimed. And once it started tilting, there was no stopping what came next. Have you ever noticed how courtrooms feel like theaters, but with higher stakes? Everything is staged, every pause deliberate, every glance calculated. And unlike a play, no one knows the ending until the final word is spoken. Nick Reiner's trial was exactly that. A high-stakes performance in which every participant played a role, whether they wanted to or not. The actors, the prosecution, the defense, witnesses, the jury, and Nick himself. The script, a story of tragedy, suspicion, and secrecy. The audience, the public, eager for clarity, certainty, and closure. From the moment the courtroom doors opened, tension was palpable. Cameras clicked, pens scratched, and murmurs filled the air. Reporters jostled for position. Observers leaned forward. Friends and family sat frozen, some nervously fiddling with tissues, others staring blankly, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of expectation. And Nick? He sat quietly, folding and unfolding his hands, staring straight ahead, absorbing every sound without a hint of acknowledgement. The silence in him was heavy. It was as if he had internalized the entire room, the entire event, and compressed it into one unbroken focus. The prosecution opened first. They didn't start with emotion. They started with narrative. A timeline was presented, minute by minute, emphasizing the separation of spaces between the main house and the guest house. They spoke of the victims, Rob and Michelle Reiner, not as flesh and blood people, but as points on a map, lines connecting dots that only the jury could follow. Each moment, each step, each decision became a chain, and at the end of that chain was a name, Nick Reiner. They highlighted proximity, access, and opportunity, repeating details about the lack of forced entry, phone records, and gaps in Nick's timeline. Each statement was carefully crafted, not to convince with emotion, but to frame certainty. The prosecution needed the jury to see inevitability, to feel it before analyzing it. Then came the defense. Their strategy was subtler. They didn't contradict the facts, they reframed them. They introduced alternative interpretations for every piece of evidence, emphasizing possibility over probability. If Nick hadn't immediately called authorities, they argued, it wasn't proof of guilt, it was shock, confusion, human hesitation. If timelines didn't align perfectly, they stressed that life doesn't run like clockwork and assumptions can mislead. The courtroom's energy shifted with each witness. A neighbor was called to testify about sounds heard that night, or the lack thereof. Their account painted ordinary life, interrupted only by speculation. Experts discussed behavioral patterns, forensic details, and timing. Every word weighed on the balance between belief and doubt. And in the audience, one could almost feel the mental tug-of-war. Every juror had to evaluate, absorb, and interpret what they were hearing, all while battling their own instincts. The human brain craves narrative closure, and when confronted with contradictions, it tends to resolve them, often in favor of what feels emotionally satisfying rather than logically airtight. Throughout, Nick remained composed, not unreadable, but precise. His reactions, or lack thereof, became silent testimony. Observers debated whether this was indifference, control, or a deeper, unreadable trauma. But perception, as always, often becomes more powerful than reality in court. And then came a moment that changed everything. A witness, previously thought insignificant, was called to the stand. Their testimony didn't involve forensic data, phone records, or security footage. It was anecdotal, personal, emotional, and yet its impact was seismic. They spoke of small, seemingly trivial interactions that hinted at tension long before December 14th. Words said in passing, doors left ajar, moments of hesitation, small inconsistencies that, when strung together, suggested a pattern. It wasn't overt evidence of crime, but pattern recognition is persuasive. Our brains are wired to see connections, to assign cause to coincidence. The prosecution relied on that instinct. The courtroom reacted subtly at first, leaning forward, exchanging glances, noting the weight of certain statements. Then, as the narrative took shape, the atmosphere grew heavier. The jury wasn't just listening. They were feeling the tension, the ambiguity, and the possibility of danger within a family once thought ordinary. Short, punchy sentences were interspersed with longer, descriptive ones in testimony, mirroring the rhythm of suspense. The courtroom became a living story, a tense, emotional pulse building with every revelation. The line between past and present blurred. The audience, both in person and later on screens, sensed the stakes in ways that facts alone couldn't convey. Direct questions from attorneys to witnesses heightened the tension. Did you see him do X? Did you hear Y? How did he react? Every answer, every pause, every slight hesitation was magnified, interpreted, and reframed. The jury's imagination filled gaps the witnesses left open. And imagination can be more persuasive than any chart or timeline. By mid-trial, the trial had evolved from a factual recounting into a performance of human behavior under scrutiny. Nick's subtle glances, small adjustments in posture, and controlled breathing became part of the story as much as the physical evidence itself. But here's the contradiction. The prosecution painted inevitability. The defense painted ambiguity. Yet both sides relied on interpretation over indisputable fact. And that's the uncomfortable reality in trials like this. Certainty is never guaranteed, but perception of certainty can be engineered. Emotional beats were strategically interspersed. Testimonies highlighted familial loyalty, trust, and betrayal. Observers noted moments of irony and subtle tension. The very things that would later dominate public conversation. Every chapter of testimony built toward crescendo points. The jury's attention was manipulated, intentionally or not, through rhythm, emotion, and selective revelation. The courtroom was a theater, the jury the audience, and Nick, whether he wanted it or not, the protagonist under scrutiny. And yet, for all the calculated narrative, contradictions persisted. Tiny details that didn't align. Witnesses who hesitated. Moments where alternative interpretations were possible. The defense seized these, attempting to create doubt, to pull jurors back from the edge of certainty. But the emotional architecture had been laid. And once emotion takes hold, even rational deliberation is colored. Have you ever had a moment where a single voice changed everything? Not gradually, not subtly, but in an instant, shifting perception, twisting assumptions, rewriting what everyone thought they knew. That's what happened when this witness took the stand. Up until now, the trial had relied heavily on timelines, phone records, and the quiet tension of Nick Reiner's demeanor. But human testimony has a way of cutting through spreadsheets and charts. It's unpredictable, emotional, resonant. And this particular testimony would do just that. The witness was someone no one expected. Not a neighbor, not a family friend, not a forensic specialist, someone peripheral. Someone whose presence had been largely overlooked, but whose observations carried weight beyond their initial impression. The moment they began to speak, the courtroom shifted. Eyes narrowed, heads tilted, attention sharpened. There's a magnetic quality to a person who speaks with conviction about ordinary events, when those events suddenly take on extraordinary meaning. They described moments from the day before the tragedy. Tiny interactions, almost mundane at the time. Doors left ajar, casual conversations, gestures unnoticed by most. But when strung together in narrative form, these small moments suggested tension, unease, a subtle disruption of ordinary life. The witness spoke slowly, deliberately, weaving emotion into detail without overstatement. Their statements painted a picture of a household where calm was fragile, where undercurrents of discomfort ran deeper than anyone realized. Each anecdote was like a brushstroke on a canvas, subtle at first, but coalescing into a portrait that made the jury pause. Here's the twist. What the witness revealed wasn't direct evidence of crime. They didn't see the act. They didn't hear threats. But perception matters. Humans are wired to detect patterns. The jury couldn't help but connect dots, filling in blanks the witness didn't intend to fill. And as the narrative unfolded, the energy in the courtroom shifted. The previously linear story, 2 victims, 1 suspect, clear timelines, began to feel layered, complex, uncertain. The prosecution's neat framework, painstakingly built over days, now wavered under the weight of human observation. Nick's posture changed subtly. He had maintained a controlled exterior through hours of testimony, but now, his jaw tightened, a flicker of tension passing across his face. The witness hadn't accused him outright. They had only described events. But the implication was undeniable. Someone close, someone familiar, had been present in critical moments leading to the tragedy. And here's the paradox. By not naming him explicitly, the witness amplified the emotional impact. The jury was left with uncertainty, and our brains tend to fill gaps with assumptions. Ambiguity becomes suspense. Suspense becomes fear. And fear, in a courtroom, is dangerously persuasive. Short sentences punctuated long ones in the testimony, mirroring the tension. The door. Open. Again. Small details, repeated for emphasis, had disproportionate weight. Jurors found themselves leaning forward, absorbing nuance that might have been overlooked in a casual setting. Questions from attorneys sharpened the focus. Did you notice this? Did you see that? Were you concerned? Every hesitation, every pause, became evidence of observation. Every slight uncertainty became a seed of doubt or conviction, depending on how it was interpreted. The prosecution subtly reinforced interpretation. Notice the pattern, they reminded. Notice the tension. The witness didn't need to connect the dots explicitly. The room did it for them. And that's the brilliance of carefully framed testimony. It allows the audience to participate, to feel discovery themselves, while the storyteller controls the narrative. But as powerful as the witness was, contradictions began to appear. Another juror noted inconsistencies in timing. A defense attorney highlighted memory limitations. And suddenly, what seemed straightforward became a puzzle again. The emotional stakes intensified. Jurors were not just evaluating facts. They were evaluating the character of those involved, the intentions behind actions, the subtle interplay of relationships that had existed long before the courtroom ever opened. Here's another twist. The witness's credibility wasn't questioned overtly. Instead, it was subtly reinforced by the prosecution. Background context, experience, demeanor, all of it implied reliability. And that implied reliability transformed narrative into authority. Nick, sitting silently, became central without speaking. His silence, previously a controlled demeanor, was now perceived differently. Was he hiding emotion? Was he processing? Or was this the calm of someone cornered? The courtroom narrative painted it in multiple ways simultaneously, leaving interpretation up to perception. And then the final blow came. The revelation no one anticipated. A detail about a past interaction, trivial on its face, but explosive in implication. It suggested that Nick had been present at a critical moment, a moment that tied into Romy's warning, a moment that the prosecution had been framing from the start. It wasn't definitive proof. It wasn't the act itself. But in context, it became a linchpin. It gave the jury a tangible connection between the suspect and the event in a way that charts, timelines, and phone records alone never could. The defense tried to downplay it. Alternative explanations, memory limits, coincidence, all raised carefully but delicately. Yet the emotional gravity remained. Witnesses like this plant seeds that grow in the mind of the observer. They linger. They twist perception. They leave unease. By the end of the day, the courtroom energy had shifted irreversibly. Jurors were thinking in layered terms, considering motives, timing, relationships, and emotional undercurrents. What began as a sequence of facts had transformed into a living story. And for Nick, the witness's testimony was a turning point. He had maintained composure for hours. He had absorbed timelines, charts, expert interpretations. He had survived scrutiny. But this narrative, personal, anecdotal, emotionally resonant, reached deeper. It challenged how he was perceived not just legally, but humanly. As he left the courtroom that day, the tension did not dissipate. It thickened. The narrative, shaped by evidence, testimony, and subtle implication, continued to evolve. The audience outside, the public watching and reading, would later interpret the same events differently, filling gaps with imagination, conjecture, and emotion. What does it mean to live under a legacy? To inherit a name that carries more weight than your own life? For Nick Reiner, this wasn't hypothetical. It was his reality. Every step, every misstep, every glance was measured against a standard set long before he was born. A standard created by parents renowned not just for their work, but for the image they projected to the world. And that image matters. Because the world doesn't just judge actions. It judges perception. It judges associations. It judges the history embedded in a name. A famous name is a double-edged sword. It opens doors, yes, but it also draws a spotlight that never fades. Even before the events of December 14th, Nick's life was framed by expectation. He wasn't just a son. He was a Reiner. People assumed they knew him because of his lineage. They assumed he carried the traits, the talents, the temperament, the charm, or the ruthlessness they associated with the name. And when tragedy struck, those assumptions became fuel for judgment. The courtroom constantly reminded everyone of this. Photographs, testimony, even the tone of proceedings referenced the family's prominence. The jury, consciously or not, understood they weren't just deciding on evidence. They were judging the heir to a legacy. Ask yourself, how does legacy shape guilt? How does recognition shape suspicion? If someone grows up in a household the public admires, does that make their actions under scrutiny more suspicious or more excusable? For Nick, the answer came in the way jurors and observers interpreted everything. A private retreat to the guest house became strategic isolation. Polite restraint became cold detachment. Long-term relationships and quiet routines became hidden motives in the court of public perception. Media coverage amplified this perception. Every article referenced the Reiner name. Headlines reminded the public not just who Nick was, but whose son he was. The narrative of a family tragedy intertwined seamlessly with celebrity fascination. Viewers, readers, and social media participants absorbed it as if familiarity justified inference. And here lies the cruel contradiction. A famous name can shield and isolate simultaneously. It gives influence and simultaneously magnifies scrutiny. It's both protection and cage. Nick's every reaction was parsed. His composure, previously understood as maturity, became interpreted as emotional suppression. His silence, previously personal, became incriminating. Every behavior was framed against a backdrop he neither chose nor controlled. Family expectations compounded the pressure. Relatives whispered. Longtime acquaintances speculated. The Reiner estate, once a private sanctuary, now served as a theater where perception dictated reality. The courtroom leveraged this awareness expertly. Prosecutors alluded to the weight of the name. This isn't just any household, they reminded jurors subtly. This is a family accustomed to order, to control, to public scrutiny. Implication: Nick was raised in a world where rules were clear, and yet here he was, entangled in chaos. The defense, however, sought to humanize him. They highlighted ordinary moments, hobbies, friendships, quiet routines, and mundane interactions that reflected vulnerability rather than calculated intent. They argued that a famous family does not preclude the ordinary struggles of any young adult navigating personal challenges. Yet humanizing moments are hard to weigh against the emotional narrative carefully curated by the prosecution. Courts are logical spaces, but humans are storytelling creatures. Context and nuance often yield to drama and clarity. And that brings us to the heart of tension, the paradox of familiarity. People knew Nick's family. They assumed patterns. They applied narrative shortcuts. And those shortcuts are powerful in shaping judgment. Jurors couldn't help but be influenced. They weren't blind to the headlines. They weren't unaware of public opinion. The famous name created an invisible weight that leaned in subtle ways throughout the trial. Yet contradictions remained. Witnesses painted Nick as composed but relatable. Close friends testified to kindness, concern, and normalcy. They described moments of empathy and engagement inconsistent with the image the prosecution framed. The tension between reputation and reality intensified. And for the audience outside the courtroom, these contradictions created curiosity and conflict. Who was the real Nick Reiner? The quiet, withdrawn young man, or the potential threat depicted in charts, timelines, and expert testimony? Every question sparked speculation. Every contradiction demanded interpretation, and every interpretation added layers to the story, deepening the intrigue. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this chapter of Nick's life was the inescapable lens of inevitability. A famous name is a magnet for expectation and judgment. It binds perception and reality in a way that ordinary individuals rarely experience. For Nick, the courtroom wasn't just a legal space. It was a mirror reflecting every assumption, every judgment, every shadow of inherited expectation. And as the trial progressed, this weight would shape not just perception, but behavior. Every gesture, every pause, every word spoken by Nick or